Hey everybody, I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Today gives me great pleasure to share with you my interview with Hadar Aviram. Her book, Yesterday's Monsters, The Manson Family Cases, and the Illusion of Parole was impressive on so many levels. One, because it deals with a very high-profile case in a nuanced and thoughtful manner, but even more so than that, the way it will make you rethink the parole system in general. I think it's an important book that I really encourage people to check out, even if they're not particularly interested in the Manson family or the California penal system. It has so many great insights that actually reach far beyond those specific concerns. Aviram is the Thomas Mueller Professor at UC Hastings College of the Law. She holds law and criminology degrees from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a Ph.D. in Jurisprudence and Social Policy from UC Berkeley. There, she studied as a Fulbright Fellow and a Regents Intern. She specializes now in criminal justice and civil rights from a socio-legal perspective. She is the author, in addition to Yesterday's Monsters, of Cheap on Crime, Recession-Era Politics, and the Transformation of American Punishment. And she is the co-editor of The Legal Process and the Promise of Justice from Cambridge University Press. I'm so happy I was able to speak with her. I think her insights, especially now on COVID and how that's affecting prison populations and ideas surrounding parole, are so important. Even if you, the listener, you don't feel like you have any connection to the prison system, maybe you haven't ever been arrested and you don't think it's a concern of yours, I think this interview helps highlight why these things should be concerns for all of us. I think it's crucial that we interrogate some of these issues much more so than we tend to do by sweeping it sort of under the rug, so to speak. And again, very happy to be able to speak with Hadar Aviram today. I'll just say, as always, more information can be found about her work, as well as her book recommendations for you at tinap.org, so make sure you check that out. And of course, check out the social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, wherever you want to follow. This is Not a Pipe podcast. Again, thank you so much, Hadar, for speaking with me today about your book. Maybe you can start by introducing what it's all about, because as I said in the intro, it takes a number of subjects as its focal points throughout the different chapters. How do you describe the book?
Yesterday's Monsters is a book about the parole hearing process in California, and it uses as its case study the cases of the Manson family inmates. These are the followers of Charlie Manson, actually Charlie Manson and his followers, who in 1969 committed a series of heinous murders and were all sentenced to death. Just a year after they were sentenced, California abolished the death penalty, and all of their sentences got commuted to life with parole. And so these people have been coming up for parole for the last 50 years. And the book uses all of the transcripts of all of their parole hearings since the 70s and interviews and some additional archival materials to tell a story about the California parole hearing process, why it is the way that it is, how it's shaped, what shaped it, and to make some recommendations to improve it.
Yeah, and you set out to obviously take on a really large topic, looking through the lens of this specific set of people, well known to most people, although maybe you can say a little bit about that case in particular, but also what was it about the case what did it allow you to do to look at the California prison system, and maybe what were some limitations as well by focusing on the Manson family?
Sure. So let me start by telling a little bit about the murders themselves for the few people who are not familiar with them. So in 1967, a man by the name of Charlie Manson comes out of prison. At that point, he was in his early 30s. He had spent most of his life behind bars for crime, including very violent crime. And the first place that he goes is the Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. The Haight-Ashbury at that point, this is after the Summer of Love, it's become a very desperate place with a lot of drugs and violence and lots of lost people looking for gurus. And this guy's very charismatic. He can play the guitar. He very quickly amasses some followers. few dozen followers, most of them young women, teenagers, late teens, early 20s, and they start following him around. They start calling themselves the family, and they buy an old bus, and they drive up and down the California coast. They make friends with people in the entertainment industry. They make friends with some biker clubs that were very big in California in the 60s, and they finally settle down in an old ranch called Spawn Ranch that was used for Western movie sets in LA. The experience of being part of this cult is pretty difficult. He is a very violent, unpredictable man. There's a lot of sexual exploitation involved. He's basically using his followers to try and get ahead in the music industry, tries to make contact with the Beach Boys and with music producers. It doesn't go anywhere. Gradually, the experience there becomes more and more sinister. And it culminates with a series of 4 murders that they commit. So they start off by basically extorting money from a musician by the name of Gary Hinman, and then they kill him afterwards. They then commit 2 stranger murders for which they're most remembered, the murder of Sharon Tate and 4 of her friends in her mansion in Beverly Hills. And then the night after, the murder of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, another couple living there. And then afterwards, one of the ranch hands, a guy by the name of Donald Shea, discovers what they're up to, and they're concerned he's gonna tell on them, and they kill him as well. Slightly different participants for each of these murders, and it takes a long time for the LAPD to crack the crimes. Finally, they do, actually, because one of the followers, a woman by the name of Susan Atkins, sort of brags about the murders while she's in jail for an unrelated offense. And that's how they get discovered. And this crime acquires a huge symbolic meaning in California and beyond. And it becomes regarded basically as the crime that killed the 60s. The crime that sort of shows that this myth of peace and love and hippies is not all it's cracked up to be and exposes violence. It's also the beginning or actually through it's part of a process in which violent crime in California, just the rates increase. People start getting very afraid about crime, and this case ends up shaping to a great degree our approaches toward crime. So this case is interesting in its own just because it's very notorious. It's high profile. A lot of people know about it. But it's also interesting because it allows me to do a couple of things. First of all, these are cases that were instrumental in shaping the way we think in California about extreme punishment. By extreme punishment, I mean a trifecta of sentences. I'm talking about the death penalty, life without parole, and life with parole. And I show in the book this case is largely responsible for shaping a situation where the 3 punishments are basically indistinguishable from each other. So we sentence a lot of people to death, but we don't actually execute them. So the death penalty is a lot like life without parole. And then life with parole is a lot like life without parole, because in the aftermath of these cases, gradually parole changes to the point that almost nobody gets parole. The rates of people actually being granted parole by the parole board are very, very low. Every time there is a legislative change, every time there's innovations in legislation about parole, it's always influenced by this case. It's always also in the shadow of this case. And in some ways, the people that are featured in these cases not only contributed to the change in sort of the climate in California about violent crime and its aftermath, but they also got changed in return by the change that happened. And you see this in the hearings themselves, which makes this case interesting. I also have 50 years worth of material, which allows me to tell a pretty convincing, I think, longitudinal story about what happened. Yeah. The thing about the case, and this is something that I've thought about a lot, is these are obviously not typical people in prison. For one thing, it's a very high profile crime, and for another, they're all white, which makes them very distinguishable because people of color are overrepresented in California prisons and in extreme punishment as well. But the attorneys that I interview who represent them and many other people on parole assure me that most of the things that I saw are actually not down to these people's notoriety, but they actually characterize a lot of what happens in other cases as well. So this is an effort essentially to draw people who wouldn't think about parole as an interesting thing to read about to learn more about parole through these cases that they might have heard about. So an effort to interest people in what happens generally on parole because of this high-profile case.
Yeah, and as you said, there's so much content that you can look at and explore through the Manson family and the people that were convicted of those murders. Taking that away or stepping back from that for a moment, what is it about parole and about the justice system that you wanted to study, that you set out to study? Like when we look outside of the Manson family, what is it that's important in this book?
So what's interesting to me here is the post-recession reforms in California. And my previous book, Cheap on Crime, which came out in 2015, was all about how we changed our approach toward punishment in the aftermath of the Great Recession. And one of the outcomes of that was a sort of a bifurcation of public opinion, right? There's all of a sudden this surge of support for reforms that help nonviolent drug offenders, both on the right and on the left. The left can benefit from this because these are cases that evoke a lot of sympathy, and because these are cases that white and black people commit at pretty much the same rates. So it becomes a big talking point for both the right and the left. And at the same time, there's this retrenchment of the idea that people who committed violent crime basically deserve what they get and don't deserve any reform or sympathy. Mm-hmm. And so what was interesting to me about this is, well, let's see how the system treats the most notorious people convicted of the most notorious violent crime in the history of California. And that's what brought me to this case. And in the course of looking at this case, I learned pretty astounding things about the California parole process. In fact, I think this is the great strength of the book. The parole process in California, and from what I hear elsewhere as well, is so Kafkaesque. And the story that I have to tell in this book is so compelling that you will find yourself having empathy and compassion for the Manson family. And if you have empathy and compassion for the Manson family, then consider the empathy and compassion you should feel for everybody who comes up before the parole board. Yeah,
I mean, it is a fascinating and sort of mind-blowing and definitely Kafkaesque is something I was thinking about as well. What is it about the parole system that makes it so Kafkaesque, that makes it so troubling once you really start to unpack things? Like, what, if anything, do you think people aren't aware of who haven't been through this system that is really surprising and troubling? So essentially what I find in the book is that the parole process is performative. I think that's the key word. Mm-hmm. We've all learned from Irving Goffman, of course, that everything is a performance. But the parole board is a very careful performance. It's orchestrated very carefully. It uses its own language. It has its own understanding of what it means to be expressing something sincerely. And the parole commissioners can change what those rules are at any time. And basically the takeaway from this is that if they don't want to let somebody out, there is very little that can be done. There's basically unfettered discretion. Everything in your file, whether it be positive or negative, evidence of disciplinary stuff, evidence of rehabilitation, any of these things can be viewed through a negative lens and is, in my case study, viewed in a negative lens. Of course, everybody who comes up for parole in California did a heinous crime because, what murder isn't heinous? But and this is exactly the point, is because they can't say that explicitly anymore, they find a lot of ways around that to interpret the person's whole file, whole dossier negatively so that the past can continue to overpower the present. And something that I think is really important for me to say now that the book's already published and we're now experiencing the horrific crisis of COVID-19 ravaging prisons, and this is something not a lot of people are aware of. There are a lot of people in America, and I'm talking about tens of thousands of people in California alone, who are old and frail and sick. They are in serious danger now in prisons, and they're on the receiving end of a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of dehumanization because we've gotten used to thinking about people only through the lens of their past crime, even if the person no longer poses any risk to public safety. The past casts this long shadow on the present and on the future and just blinds our eyes from seeing what's actually in front of us, like who the person actually is now. Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things to me, when I picked up the book, I had a certain understanding of what it would be about. But what I didn't expect was just how existential a lot of the questions that you pose and a lot of the themes that are raised, just how sort of philosophical they are, because it's really about, the authenticity of a person, the performance of what it means and the performance of self, as well as the way that we can interpret discourses of truth that you wouldn't necessarily think about in an objective setting that the criminal justice system is generally supposed to be. How do you weigh those things when it comes down to a codified legal system versus the things that you talk about in the book about, basically, to paraphrase, whether people feel like the person is sincere or not? How do you weigh those things?
Well, this is really tough, right? Because there are some legal guidelines and there is a lot of case law that instructs us, for example, to figure out if somebody feels remorse for the crimes, right? We assume that remorse is something important to know. And I think some of it is because we think that somebody who's remorseful is more deserving of compassion. And also because we make the connection that somebody who's remorseful is probably not likely to repeat the crime. But the key to this whole set of assumptions is that we can actually tell who's being remorseful and who isn't. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that I found out in this book is that there's this expectation that people are going to express remorse in a particular way. It's kind of a, sort of think about a sort of mediocre, community theater production of what remorse should look like. And if you don't want to let somebody go, you can always say that the way that they expressed remorse was inauthentic, or that you didn't believe them, that they were remorseful. I mean, we see a lot of this remorse conversation. This is why this is existential way beyond the parole, even in the public sphere. I mean, we're constantly seeing people apologize on social media for, any number of ills, and then other people chiming in and saying that it's not enough or that they don't believe them. We're very invested in kind of the business of adjudicating whether other people's apologies are sincere. And I think that the parole hearing is one great example of this, of the huge, enormous hubris that we have, which is not really borne by empirical data. Humans are notoriously bad at telling whether another person is telling the truth or whether another person's remorse is genuine. And nonetheless, these hearings evince this kind of metaphysical ability that the commissioners think that they have to tell who is for real and who isn't.
In doing so, does it create, beyond the actual hearings and deciding whether someone is eligible for parole, maybe you could say a little bit about how the justice system is set up in the sense that it's supposed to work versus how it actually works, that you found with the Manson family, but also, by the sounds of it, with a lot of people in California and elsewhere, where, among other things, it sounds like people are supposed to consider how likely it is that someone will reoffend and how likely it is that they can join the community. But then what actually happens is this whole idea of, like, is the person authentic and is the person real in the way that they're expressing their remorse and these kinds of things. So yeah, maybe you could say a little bit about what the justice system is supposed to do when it comes to parole and how it actually works.
Perhaps it might be helpful if I walk through the way that parole developed historically and seeing how its meaning basically changed. It starts off as part of California's correctional system, which is a very bureaucratically heavy, professional, heavy, expensive machine. In the 50s and the 60s, lots of psychologists, a lot of social workers. Some of the people listening to us probably remember the classic scenes from Shawshank Redemption featuring Red coming up before the parole board. And there's a group of people asking him if he's a danger to society. So that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And parole at that point is very, very common because pretty much everybody comes up before the parole board. Because the sentencing system at the time worked in a way that the judge would give you a range, like, 3 to 20 years for a robbery. And you would start coming up after 3 years and they would let you out whenever they would. And then for a variety of reasons, that system gets changed in California in the mid-70s when California pioneers the idea of determinate sentencing. And then there's going to be this island of indeterminacy, and that's going to be the island of the people doing life with parole. So this already kind of shrinks the mandate of the parole board to just the people who have done the most serious crimes. Gradually, we continue by politicizing that, so victims start getting more of a role in the system. Prosecutors get more of a role in the system, and California gets a 2-step parole process, which is in 1988, we throw in this extra step, which is that even if the parole grants you, basically recommends your release, your case comes before the governor, and the governor has 4 months to veto their decision and keep you inside. It's best explained as a shift from sort of professionals who are toiling in obscurity and were sort of immune to public critique, to politicians, to victims, to the public, to this very high emotion, high balance driven discourse about who deserves to stay in, who deserves to get out. In the process of that happening, the commissioners themselves become politicized. They're political appointees of the governor, mm-hmm. and invariably they're selected from law enforcement backgrounds. We just heard of Governor Newsom appointing somebody 2 days ago, former warden. It's all former wardens, former chiefs of police, former sheriffs, people who invariably come from law enforcement backgrounds rather than from those classic therapeutic social workers and psychologists. Mm-hmm. So you're seeing this transformation. We're shifting away from the idea that a person needs to have a job and a supportive family and a plan, but rather we're going to sort of excavate the soul that they've changed. And this brings me to the central concept here, which is insight. The board is always looking for is whether the person has insight. And insight means whatever the board wants it to mean. So it's sort of a combination of remorse for your crime plus a very deep level understanding of what it is that brought you to commit the crime and an understanding that you are no longer that person, kind of like a credible show that you've psychologically transformed yourself and you're no longer that person. And this can take a lot of different forms because, first of all, not everybody tells, a complicated self-excavation story. People have to be trained to do that. Even the people that do don't necessarily do it in a way that the board finds genuine. For example, I found in my study people getting chastised for using the buzzwords. Like, if you're supposed to show insight, but if you actually use the word insight, that suggests to them that you rehearsed. So you have to kind of like find a way to do this sort of rehearsed authenticity, kind of like you have to say basically what they mean, but you have to find some way to make it sound fresh so that they think that you mean it.
Yeah.
And you can do this dozens of times because, they could just continue prodding you because they don't think you've excavated far enough. I mean, there's people in my study who had gone to dozens of hearings and then they're like, well, we heard about your mom last time. Maybe now you're going to talk about your dad. So it's kind of like constantly digging up your personal psychology in the hopes of finding something that's going to be persuasive to them.
Yeah, it's a really incredible story that I don't think very many people know about when it comes to this aspect of parole, unless they've been through it or they know people who have been through it. One of the interesting things, as you mentioned, is the politicization of the whole process, and that some of the Manson family members, correct me if I'm wrong, but were going to be paroled, but then the governor stepped in and said no, probably because it didn't look good politically. Is that fair?
Exactly. So there's 3 people who have already been recommended for parole. Bruce Davis has been recommended for parole pretty consecutively since 2012, consistently. Leslie Van Houten has been recommended for parole since 2017. Bobby Beausoleil has been recommended for parole since 2019. Again, all of these people are people in their 70s. They have families, they have friends, they have advanced degrees. They are not the people that they were in the 60s in California in their teens. And yet you find the governor reversing those recommendations time after time. And this is another aspect of the politicization of this, is that victims have become much better organized. I talk a lot in the book about the Tate family, orchestrate the kind of the showing from the victims at these hearings. But there are internet petitions, thousands of complete strangers who know nothing about these people. All of this finds its way to the governor's desk.
Yeah, and that's, to me, one of the most troubling, but also I think it makes the most sense when you think about the political climate right now. We're having this conversation not long after the Democratic and the Republican national conventions were aired, and I noticed how the threat from the Republicans, the threat that if Biden is elected, basically all violent criminals will be set free, it kept coming up, and those kinds of phrases kept coming up. To me, it's interesting because, as you said, Manson family, horrific crimes, but after reading the book and thinking about 70-year-olds who, are probably not going to live very much longer, but being stuck in a 1960s discourse, it takes 200 pages or so to make a nuanced argument about how the parole system works and all of this stuff. In today's political discourse, it seems, you have about one sentence at best, and it constantly, it seems to be, if you vote Biden, in this case, violent criminals will be out on the streets. How do you weigh those things when you obviously want to make nuanced, articulate arguments, but you're also very aware, and I think governors are also very aware, that all they're thinking about is the headline, Manson family set free, right?
Right. So the first thing I want to say is I want to make sure that we all understand that this is not a quintessentially Republican or right-wing thing. This is not endemic to the right. I see exactly the same patterns in the left. It's just people that people on the left don't like. I see this in the context of domestic violence, in the context of sex offenses. I see a lot of punitiveness on the progressive side, for example, toward people who are cruel to animals. I see the same kind of dissections, endless dissections of people's apologies to see if they're true on the left whenever there's some sort of Me Too type of scandal. So the same pattern of kind of like basically primarily conceiving of ourselves as victims or as people who judge other people's apologies is something that we've all marinated in America from right to left. So in that respect, I don't see a huge difference. I will say that for me, one of the starkest places of finding that in the source material was the last hearing of Susan Atkins, who is one of the Manson family members who passed away at the age of 60 of a brain tumor. And her last hearing in 2009, just a few months before she died, she couldn't even walk in the room because she was already basically unconscious. She gets wheeled into the room on a gurney. She's represented by her husband, who's a Harvard-educated attorney, and the commissioners just behave as if there isn't a very sick, terminally ill person on a gurney in the room. They ask her if she needs a hearing aid for the hearing when it's obvious she can't hear them because she's not responsive. Deborah Tate, Sharon Tate's sister, basically stands up and says she is still a public risk because people still glorify her crimes, right? Standing on top of this woman who's going to die in a few months, claiming that she's a risk to public safety. And the commissioners basically agree with her, and they don't let her out, and she ends up dying alone in prison instead of at home with her husband. When her husband says, I'm going to take care of her, I'm going to hire help and whatever, they mock him. They say, well, it's so nice that you can afford these things. And to me, that they can speak like that about this woman and make the effort to imagine her at age 20, when the 60-year-old woman, if there's anything that can get us around it, I think it's right now the narrative of COVID. I've just seen this happen in California in the context of incarcerated firefighters. So one of the recent developments is that as of just a few days ago, the California legislature is going to eliminate the criminal record limitations on working as a firefighter. And this is because we have thousands of people in California prisons who work as firefighters while they're in prison. It's ridiculous pay, it's brutal shifts, but it's a place that they really appreciate and a job that gives them meaning and passion and hope. It's also the only place in the California prison system where people of different races and enemy gangs work shoulder to shoulder and become friends. So the problem is not with the fact that we have incarcerated firefighters. The problem is that we pay them a pittance, and then when they get out, they don't get a job because you have to have a clean criminal record to be a firefighter. So I think that COVID and the California fires have somewhat changed the narrative to the sense that people are beginning to realize that these are actual human beings. I'm seeing some of the same thing now with the struggle to release the older, more frail people on parole. There's, of course, this argument that they're endangering public safety and you do the crime, you do the time. But I think that at least some people can be persuaded that a 60-year-old person with a bullet in their lung is not probably going to be a huge risk to public safety, right? They're not going to go back to street crime. They themselves face the risk of getting infected in COVID and dying. And to me, the anecdote about Susan Atkins, the tragedy of the last hearing of Susan Atkins, pretty much tells you everything you need to know about why we're not able to make faster headway now and get these people out from a place where they face illness and death because of the prison's ineptitude.
Yeah, I mean, it's a stark reality that you realize the more you uncover the details of these situations. But at the same time, as you said, on both sides, it seems to be political death to be weak on crime. And particularly while left and right might be able to accept nonviolent criminal offenses, violent crime is still something that very few people, it seems, when you do these political census questions and stuff, they're still very much opposed to forgiveness in terms of violent crime. Is there a way to move towards something that actually works in terms of parole and in terms of making it a less dangerous political move on either side to say we are going to reform people even if they did something horrendous, 20 years ago? Sure.
No, there's numerous recommendations. So I want to start with the obvious, which is that we just have to have a change in perspective. That rehabilitation is not about, a person's, presumed psychic epiphany about themselves. Rehabilitation is as rehabilitation does. And this whole thing starts and ends with the fact that prisons don't actually offer meaningful, evidence-based, proven, successful rehabilitation programs. When they're required to do all kinds of things or participate in all kinds of programs, they don't have access to them. In fact, one of the really shocking things for me to find out when I was doing research for this book is that the California Parole Board regularly recommends, or actually I shouldn't say recommend, regularly requires people to attend rehabilitation programs that don't exist or that they don't have access to.
Yeah.
So, for example, if they say you have to take anger management, but there is no anger management in Folsom, right, or something like that, the attorneys will assign you some self-help books so that you can come to your next hearing and say, well, there isn't an anger management program in my facility, but I read I'm okay, you're okay. Or, some people are going to be for their own good, actually, in administrative segregation. They can't attend programs because other people are going to kill them. Right. One of the people in my sample was mixed up in a bitter dispute with the Aryan Brotherhood. This is a hippie. He wasn't about to join the Aryan Brotherhood, and they tried to kill him several times. And he couldn't attend programming because he was held in solitary for his own good. So we're not really doing a lot to prepare people to the point where they can show up with a dossier that really tells us that they can succeed on the outside. Mm-hmm. So that's the main and first thing that has to change. But there's a lot of other things that have to change as well. Just eliminating the extra political layer of the governor saying yay or nay is going to be a big thing. Finding a better place for the victims to get what they need for closure is also going to be important. I had a wonderful mentor back in law school many, many years ago, legal philosophy giant Ruth Gavison, and she once said, the first and foremost thing that we owe victims is for them to stop being victims as soon as possible. And I think that in this country, we're doing exactly the opposite. On all sides of the political spectrum, we're encouraging people to, because if they're not victims, they're not being listened to. And that means that victims are going to consistently come up in situations where people offer them apologies that are not going to read as genuine because people are making them in contexts where they have something to gain, to get their life back, to get their job back, to get out of prison. I mean, it's understandable that people don't find these apologies believable. We have got to come up with better restorative justice options where people can offer these apologies in a place where they don't have anything to gain, where the apology is just being offered for apology's sake. So just removing that whole scene of the apology, which for reasons that I explain in the book comes off as wooden anyway because they're not even allowed to address the victims. It's very artificial. It's very fraught. Just move that whole bit of reconciliation and reckoning and redemption out of this process. It has no place there. So that's another recommendation. Then, of course, there's all kinds of other shenanigans that happen with the way disciplinary files are being read. And the fact that there's no proper record keeping from year to year. So people rehash the same incidents year after year after year without true understanding of what actually happened there. So lots of things that can change. For the most part, I think we just have to think of the fact that we now have so much scientific confirmation that beyond a certain age, people simply age out of crime. And if the role of the parole board is not to, quote unquote, give people what they deserve, but rather to determine who's not a risk to public safety, I think we can safely say on the basis of, what is it now, 30 years of life course criminology, that generally speaking, people 50 and over are not that much of a risk.
One of the things that I found really interesting was the way that the possible discourses or the acceptable discourses changed from the time that the Manson family murders occurred and that the trials were going on to more recent things like, as you said, life course criminology studies, but also understandings of cults. I mean, the early representations of being sort of brainwashed by a cult leader weren't acceptable, but now are sort of. If you look at the common discourses that are permitted in the courts and that are accepted more readily by the general public, maybe you could say a little bit about how that changed, maybe in this specific case, but also how understandings have changed how we think about things like parole.
Sure. We are talking, after all, about 50 years. And in 50 years, there was a lot about public thinking changes. One thing before I talk about cults, which in itself is a really interesting wrinkle to all this, I will say that the women who were being seen as these diabolical monsters at the time, you can also look at them through a Me Too lens and see that these girls were starving. They didn't have enough food. They were hopped out on drugs. They were regularly sexually exploited by Manson, by other people. Today, looking at that whole scenario through a Me Too lens, you would come to very different conclusions about the women. But the cult thing in itself is interesting because at the time that this stuff is happening, obviously Manson was not the only, seemingly charismatic but actually sinister cult leader. There were many others that were operating at the time in the West Coast. One of them, the granddaddy of health food in California, Father Yod, was a pretty shady character. So there was this phenomenon, but people didn't have the language to talk about it because people thought about brainwashing in the context of things like the Korean War. Like this was something that communists, in East Asia did to you when you got caught, right? That was the kind of the understanding. And the understanding that this is actually something that's happening on the domestic level and that thought control is real and it's not just part of the Korean War only starts percolating in California in the 70s. And even then it's super careful. I have records from the California legislature holding hearings about cults because at that point there's already parents of, people in their late teens and early 20s, exactly the age of the Manson followers who got trapped with the Moonies and all kinds of apocalyptic Christian cults. And they're saying, well, give me back my children. And the legislator who's holding the hearings, Marvin Dimley, says, I have to be really careful with the First Amendment here. A lot of these people are legally adults. The interesting thing is that at that hearing, which happens in 1974, Ted Patrick shows up. Ted Patrick is the granddaddy of deprogramming. This is the first people who would, kidnap people, take them to hotel rooms and try to sort of make them question the cult and its teachings.
Mm-hmm.
And he explicitly says at the hearing, had the Manson family case come up now, meaning in 1974 as opposed to 1971, we would have seen these victims not as perpetrators. And I don't know if it's quite as simple as he says, but I think the approach would definitely have been better. And yet this doesn't percolate into the parole hearing room, because in the parole hearing room, you're supposed to show insight. You're supposed to blame only yourself for everything that happened. Any efforts to claim that there's environmental or circumstantial things that might have contributed to this are rejected. You're minimizing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a similar thing that's happened in terms of change is the way that we look at children and teens and
Mm-hmm.
adolescents now. And this is a recent move, at least as far as the Supreme Court is concerned. It only starts in 2005 with Roper versus Simmons, when we suddenly stop and we say, hey, wait a minute, we can't give juveniles the death penalty because their prefrontal cortex is not developed enough. They can't delay gratification. They can't resist peer pressure. They can't make good decisions. And we gradually begin to tease out the ways that they're different. Now, compare that approach to, for example, seeing the footage of the interrogations from the Central Park Five in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
I sometimes show the film, the documentary about the Central Park Five, to my students, and I have students in tears. They cannot believe that children are treated this way.
Yeah.
And I try to explain to them in 1985, they were not seen as children. They were seen as super predators and psychopaths, and they were treated regardingly. We didn't know what we know now about neuroimaging and developmental psychology. And so now, if there was an effort, and I think this is one thing that maybe the Manson family members have benefited from, which is that before, their young ages were not being taken into account. And now, by law, they have to be taken into account at parole hearings. So that is something that they might be able to benefit of. But again, this is all very new. And it just represents this rediscovery of childhood that we've had in the last 15 years.
It's a fascinating way in which, especially in this case, you can look at decades of change and realize that, as you said, if this was an event that happened right now, I think we could easily see the sort of cult aspect, but also the Me Too aspect, in that they were manipulated and therefore are victims rather than perpetrators. And I think that would be a much easier sell today than it was at the time. Curious how the historical moment during which the crime happens versus the historical moment a person makes a claim to be able to enter society again. How do those two fit together? I mean, you talk about this a bit in the book, but yeah, if you commit a crime in 1960, when people don't have functional MRIs that allow us to see the difference between a young adult and a fully developed adult brain, they don't have understandings of cults and things like that, then that doesn't get into account when you're tried. But theoretically, that should come into play during parole. But as you said, it doesn't necessarily work that way. So how do those things align and how do they not align? Like, how do the discourses change? Does it eventually meet, or are they always going to be based on when you committed the crime?
So I think there's a great tension, I think, like the need to consider young age, which means that now a lot of septuagenarians and, pretty old people in terms of prison, not in terms of life on the outside, people age faster in prison, are now being, suddenly considered for parole in a serious way when they weren't before, because we suddenly discovered that they were young when they committed the crime. And they were young when they committed the crime the whole time. It's just that now it's become salient because the Supreme Court now demands that the parole board consider that. As to the other factors, unless they are basically embraced by the law and there's an explicit instruction to the board to consider them, which basically also gives them political coverage for a decision to release, and that's why the law plays an important role here. But if the law doesn't do it explicitly, the board is conditioned to interpret any effort to refer to the context as minimizing. There's countless examples in my source material for the book of the people in my book saying to the parole board, it was the 60s, I was lost, I wanted to impress a biker gang, I was sleeping with Charlie and wanted to impress him, there was nowhere for me to go, and it's just being wholesale rejected by the board and excoriated by the prosecutor who is in the room and serves as sort of a moral memory of the board. So there's examples, for example, of Stephen Kay, who was one of the prosecutors in the original case and continued to go to these hearings decades after the convictions. And he says, this whole 60s thing is hogwash. I was in Berkeley in the 60s and I didn't end up murdering anybody. So there's this idea that you can't really rely on context at all. If you talk about your personal background, it's only in this excavation effort of understanding how you were capable of committing this crime. And the bottom line is that even as late as 2013, for example, the board says to one of the people in my book, Leslie Van Houten, you've talked about this, you've talked about that, you've talked about your background, but we still haven't been able to understand how you could have participated in this. And perhaps the answer is, not everything you can understand. Not everything is a mediocre Lifetime movie special. Some things we're just not going to be able to understand. Sometimes you look back at your life and you see things there that you can't explain. Or sometimes, and this is, I think, another thing that is maybe worth talking about. I recently heard an interesting Buddhist scholar tell that the ancient Greeks thought of life as somebody who's sitting in a boat and rowing down the river, and their back is toward the front of the boat, so they can't see where the boat is going. But the more they row, the more of the past they can see. And the past changes context. So the picture that they see of the past keeps changing as time passes by. And I think this is one of the things that you see in these hearings. You see that the story keeps changing. And I think partly the story keeps changing because people just don't know what to say anymore. People will say things like, maybe to themselves, I talked about how I didn't have a father figure last year and it didn't help. So today I'm going to talk about my mother. It's just, this is not getting us anywhere is basically what I'm trying to say. And there are no guarantees that the people we're dealing with can even tell whether it's genuine or not to the extent that it matters. We have got to let this go, and we have got to just conclude that we actually have not bad tools of predicting whether people will commit crime or not. These extremely long sentences are pretty useless. They're expensive. They don't protect the public. We have got to let go of this. It does not serve us well.
Yeah, I think that's a message that I hear more and more frequently, especially if I go to criminology conferences or things of that nature. A lot of people who study this through empirical data and qualitative data kind of understand that, and it's very clear. Yet there are all these other discourses, like I said earlier, the political ones, and just the idea that violent criminals should be locked away and we should throw away the key. And that just seems like common knowledge on a different level, not among people who work with those people, but among the general public. That seems like common sense, right? If you're a bad person, you're a bad person. And I don't know how often you talk to people outside of the disciplines that you're involved in, but I wonder if you found that there are certain discourses that work better than others. Like, for example, arguably throwing away a lot of money, taxpayer money, on some of these ideas that aren't helpful. We're also creating criminals or de-incentivizing people to change when they're, forced to be in jail or prison for a very long time. So there's the rehabilitation discourses or therapeutic discourses. I mean, there's a bunch of different ways that you could present what essentially is the argument that our prison system doesn't work at all. Are there better or worse ways that you found when talking to different groups of people?
So I've been talking to a lot of people outside my disciplines because public advocacy and outreach is something that a big chunk of my career is devoted to. And in the aftermath of the financial crisis, what seemed to work was the financial argument, was the idea that we're just spending an enormous amount of money on this and it's not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. And it was more persuasive in some areas than in others. And we saw that it was a big triumph in the context of nonviolent people. In the context of violent people, it didn't go anywhere. I mean, you can still see California spending more than $150 million per year just on the existence of death row. This is money that if you just took all these people and you moved them to general population out of death row, that expense would just not exist. So we're seeing that the money argument is more useful in some contexts than it is in others. And in Sheep on Crime, I tried to figure out where it is. I think that because we've become basically a political, emotionally driven, populistic nation. And I think it's especially true in the case of California, which as a state has a very sort of emotive political culture. It's all going to have to come down to anecdotes. I think one of the reasons why we've been successful with the firefighter fight is because there are personal anecdotes, because people can understand heroism. They can understand that this is a particular person who is working for them. It is also true that that benefit is only going to be available to people basically convicted of nonviolent crimes. And this is the major, I think, challenge that we're facing now with the lawsuits that are trying to get people out of San Quentin and with the advocacy before the governor trying to save people who are old and frail and have already spent decades in prison. We have all the science that you need, but we have got to give you some political cover. We have got to show people that this is you do the crime, you do the time is really not a mantra that has served us well. It has not made us safer. It has cost us a lot of money. And it's brutal not only on people, but also on their families in important ways. I think maybe the best argument that I can make for this now is COVID. I mean, the virus is not a kind teacher, but it's a very powerful one. And the argument that you can just let people die and pretend like they don't exist just doesn't work. The virus doesn't read the California Penal Code. It doesn't know where the gate of San Quentin is. It just infects available hosts. Mm-hmm. Prisons are not closed. They're permeable. I have the numbers to show this. When people in prison get sick, a few days later, there's a spike in the surrounding community. This is what happened in Marin County, the county that surrounds San Quentin. This is what happens with Lassen County, which surrounded a couple of other prisons with big outbreaks. This is just a thing. They are part of the community, and what happens to them affects the community at a very basic level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and it's an important lesson that, as you said, if you can get people to sympathize with Manson family convicts, which I think you do, and which I think is hard not to if you read the book, then we can easily make a case for significant changes in how we treat the criminal justice system and how we treat prisoners. Where do you want to go next as you think about further scholarship, as you think about maybe your next book, or just talking to different communities? What are some of the messages that you hope to continue and maybe pursue in new ways now?
So I've started working on my next book, which is going to be about the COVID outbreak in California prisons. And in many ways, this new book that I'm now working on is the third part of a trilogy that started with Cheap on Crime and continued with Yesterday's Monsters. Because essentially what I want to show is how the chickens of only looking at nonviolent crime and ignoring violent offenders have come home to roost in a way that's created these political limitations that are stopping us from doing the right thing. If the political goodwill was there, we could within weeks let go of 50% of the California prison population without a noticeable uptick in crime. There are a lot of people inside, and that the overcrowding inside is not only harmful for the people in prison, but it's harmful for everybody. So that's another thing. That's one major thing I think that we learn. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we learn is how easy it is to dehumanize. We can see examples of prison authorities being painfully aware of what's going to happen months ago, not taking any noticeable steps to prevent the problem from happening. The time to start thinking about releasing people was in March, and nothing was done, certainly not to the extent that it needs to get done. It's shocking to see how many offers they had for free testing donated by philanthropists, for help in lots of other ways, and they just refused and said they could handle it themselves. And now they're shamelessly arguing in these legal cases that they did all they could, that they gave it the old college try.
Mm-hmm. Is there a valuable way of talking to people who seem to at first have a knee-jerk reaction that says effectively, you shouldn't have committed a crime if you didn't want to go to jail? Basically, don't see them as human, or they don't want to think of them at all. I think there's a significant group in America that, if not explicitly, then implicitly thinks like that, right? Once you've committed a crime, you're not really part of humanity anymore. You're not really a true American citizen anymore. You shouldn't be voting. You shouldn't be having any kind of perk. You shouldn't be let out. It seems like these are very entrenched ideas. Is there a way to get through to those people, or are they perhaps the people who hold those opinions strongly, not the ones that we should be talking to when it comes to these kinds of changes?
I think it's important to talk to everybody. I think the extent to which people can be persuaded can differ from person to person. I can say that one argument that I've found pretty persuasive, especially with folks that are self-defined law and order types, mm-hmm. is to talk about the California Penal Code and to ask them to show me where in the California Penal Code does it say that the punishment for grand theft is to die from a terrible virus with no medical treatment whatsoever, and, to be in a situation where you can't socially distance yourself. Or I draw people's attention, this I think is especially effective with folks who support the death penalty, to the fact that just in the course of this pandemic, more people have died on death row from this virus than were killed in executions by the state in the entire century.
Wow.
So more people are dying in this moratorium than died when the death penalty was still in effect. And just ask people whether this makes them feel more or less safe.
Yeah. It's such a huge set of issues and related issues. It seems almost impossible to make significant change. And yet you've been doing inspiring work, and you're continuing to with your next book. What sort of outlook do you have, or what do you think about in terms of, I don't know, maybe the next 5 years, 10 years that you hope to work towards, at least in a small part, through your own work and also through the people that you're working with? Is there a vision you have that you hope maybe in 5 years we'll get there, or we'll get to a step towards that?
So famously, Rahm Emanuel once said, in a completely different context, you can't let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that my work on Cheap on Crime was about how we didn't let the financial crisis go to waste. I think we are now experiencing a serious, frightening, daunting crisis, and we can't let it go to waste. This is the opportunity to talk about bodies, to talk about public health, to talk about how everybody's a human being. And I think we can't pass on that opportunity. So that is the drum that I personally am planning to beat for the foreseeable future.
It was so interesting to read about this situation, like the specifics of the Manson family, but also the much larger general picture. So that's why I would say that, yeah, to anyone listening who hasn't picked it up, Yesterday's Monsters is obviously enlightening in terms of the Manson family murders in those cases, but it says so much more than that. Really fascinating to talk to you about it as well. And I just want to thank you so much for your time and your insights today.
Thank you, Chris, for inviting me on board.
Thank you again for listening to and supporting This Is Not a Pipe podcast. I really do appreciate it. I definitely appreciate it when people contact me with ideas about books, authors they want to hear more about. You can do that at tinap.org. You can also see more about the authors I've interviewed and their own book recommendations for you, as well as what's in the pipeline to come. And of course, there is the social media platforms that you can follow: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and see what's coming and what's out now. Thank you again. Until next time, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.